1 second. Okay, it looks like we are live. So thanks everyone for joining me either very early in the morning or what will be late for you very soon. So this morning we're getting started with our second keynote speaker. Yesterday we heard from Dermot Moran, and today we're hearing from JC Beall. So a brief introduction. He is a professor, I think the O'Neill Family Professor of Philosophy at Notre Dame, or the University of Notre Dame. He has interest in, is published widely in philosophical logic, theology, and in particular analytic theology. He's published many articles, books, encyclopedia entries for Stanford Encyclopedia, textbooks, and the like. I could go on for a while. The book that caught my interest and that kind of made me more aware of the work he's doing and has motivated me to want to read more is this book published by the Oxford University Press, The Contradictory Christ, in which he argues that Christ is a true contradiction. And there's other books that follow up upon this one. And so I'm very excited to hear his talk today. The title of the talk is 10 Objections to Contradictory Theology. So please, the floor is yours, JC.
Okay, thanks, Greg. One thing I forgot to say before the talk, but we could do it quickly now if you want. I could circulate the paper to at least the people here, if people would be of interest. It's a very so I'll try to do that while I tell you what the paper is like. The paper is for a volume on it's a Routledge volume on contradiction and theology. And so this paper is, what you're getting is a first partial draft. I ask that you do not quote from it and don't distribute it because it's really just a first draft for this. And I would love to get feedback to grow it out a little bit, particularly bibliographical stuff that I'm not aware of, surely. Okay, as Greg said, much of my work has been in logic and philosophy of logic, truth theory, and recently I've done some work in so-called analytic theology, which is basically take the tools of analytic philosophy and apply it within a particular tradition in theology. In my case, I'm incompetent with respect to things sort of beyond the standard Christian theology. So that's what that's where my area of competence is. As Greg said, I wrote a book that came out this year. I think it was this year, 2021, right? That's when we are, that's where we are. Okay.
Yeah.
Then
What
it came
year
out
is it?
this, yeah, seriously. It came out this year, called The Contradictory Christ. That was on the Incarnation. And there's a follow-up book on the Trinity called Divine Contradiction, and that is in press with Oxford now. This paper goes through the 10 objections that I have received either in print or in correspondence over and over again. And so I'm taking the opportunity to just sort of answer them. So here we go. Let me set some terminology first. So a couple things. A truth-value glut, dual to the familiar truth-value gaps, is a sentence or proposition or claim or what have you that's both true and false. That is, it's a truth whose logical negation is also true. And dually, a gap is a sentence or proposition or what have you that's neither true nor false. It's an untruth whose logical negation is also untrue. So these are just mirror images of each other, gaps and gluts. A glut theoretic account of a given phenomenon is one that involves gluts. The true theory of the given phenomenon contains gluts. If, as I'll assume, contradictions are sentences of the form, it is true that P and it is false that P, that's the form of a contradiction. Contradictions entail sentences of that form, then a glut theoretic account of some phenomenon is one that involves contradictions. The true theory of the given phenomenon contains contradictions. And here I want to mention one other terminological point before getting on to the main gist. Some, particularly in this workshop, might wonder about the neologism coined by Graham Priest and Richard Sylvan, formerly Routley, dialphism. This is one specific ism in the broader family of glut theoretic accounts of reality. It's an ism that, by Priest's account, is fueled, at least originally, by various views about meta-languages and the like. Incidentally, Priest somewhere talks about the whole point of a dialethic approach to language is to take a certain view on these meta-languages and stuff. I used to use the term, but have since found it unhelpful. One can obviously be a glut theorist, that is, accept that some true theories contain gluts or they're contradictory without having specific views about languages or meta-languages and so on. Accepting that there are gluts, true contradictions, isn't itself some ism any more than accepting that there are true conjunctions or untrue disjunctions is an ism. And so for these reasons, I use the simpler and older terminology of gluts and gaps, with gluts being coined in print in the 70s by Kit Fine and used by Mike Dunn and others around that time. Okay, enough terminology. Theology and contradiction. Gluts appear to be rare, and much of reality appears to be fully and truly described without them. I should note that Zach Weber in particular disagrees strongly, and he published a recent book that argues that gluts are as common as gaps. I set that aside here. So gluts appear to be rare, but that most phenomena are truly described without gluts, that is, truly described without logical inconsistency, doesn't imply that all phenomena are as such. Traditional monotheism and the omni properties standardly involved therein have long carried the appearance of contradiction. Witness the infamous stone problem of omnipotence, or the "this sentence is unknowable by God" problem for omniscience, etc. A natural glut theoretic account of God's given omni properties takes at least some of them to be glutty. The given predicates are both true of and false of God. A more concrete example of contradictory theology arises in specifically Christian theology, centering on the incarnation and, in turn, Trinitarian reality. On standard Christian theology, God incarnate is one person, divine and human. The God-man appears very much on the surface to be contradictory, having all the limitlessness of God while firmly bound by the limitations common to us and essential to human nature. Predicates such as knows all truths appear to be both true of and false of the incarnate God. Such apparent contradictions have long fueled a quest to consistentize the incarnation in Christian theology, a quest to give a full but consistent account of God incarnate. And the routes towards consistentizing the incarnation, similarly Trinity, generally proceed by metaphysical construction, For example, the metaphysics is more complicated than we thought. Or semantical construction. For example, the predicates like knows all truths mean something other than what we thought. Or epistemological construction. For example, our limited epistemic state is forced to see apparent but non-veridical contradiction in the incarnation, or all of those. The glut theoretic account of the target God-man, the incarnation per standard Christian doctrine, is not only natural, but also simpler than any of the known routes towards consistency. I make that case in that book. I won't review it here. But in a nutshell, the incarnation strongly appears to be contradictory because the reality is contradictory. At least some predicates are both true of and false of the target incarnate God. Along these lines, getting around the given contradiction results in lost truths. The reality of incarnation, similarly Trinity, is contradictory. There are more truths of the given reality than any logically consistent account can contain. Another virtue of a glut theoretic approach to specifically Christian theology is that the long-standing apparent contradictions involved in both the incarnation and Trinity enjoy a unified treatment, namely that divine reality is contradictory. Its full truth involves contradictions. I make that case in this follow-up book, Divine Contradiction, which focuses on the Trinity. By my lights, the simplicity and naturalness of a suitable contradictory Christian theology, especially in comparison with would-be consistent accounts, makes contradictory theology the front-running approach. The question is whether there are serious objections or problems that eventually remove contradictory theology from the field of viable candidates. Okay, 10 objections. In what follows, I address 10 common objections to contradictory theology. Objections to glut theory in general are sufficiently answered in a variety of places, notably by Priest, Sylvan, and others, and some of my work. I focus only on objections to contradictory theology in particular. A few of the target 10 objections are addressed elsewhere, the 2 books I mentioned, but they are so common as to merit repeating. The following objections are in no special order, except that the last 2 deal with slightly more technical issues around logic and theology. And just for time reasons, I may skip those, and if people want to ask about them, we can talk about them. So I'll focus on the first 8 or fewer, depending. I wouldn't mind stopping in a half hour from now if we can, of the talk, and then we'll just do questions. All right, so the first one, contradiction and methodological rules of inquiry. Objection. Contradictory theology completely undermines standard methods of inquiry that guide the search for truth. Jettisoning standard methods of inquiry resigns the pursuit of truth to an arbitrary process, unmoored from standards that have successfully guided theologians since the beginning. Accordingly, contradictory theologies come at the cost of giving up the very methods and standards on which theological truth is found. Reply. The objection would undermine contradictory theology were it correct in its principal claim, namely, that standard methods of truth-seeking inquiry must be abandoned. That's just not so. In fact, quite the opposite. The very same methodological rules of thumb that have so successfully guided the pursuit of true theories remain exactly as they are now and as they always have been. There are 3 traditional and very salient methodological rules of thumb that guide truth-seeking inquiry, that guide the pursuit of true theories. The 3 rules of thumb are familiar. First, seek complete theories. In short, one should seek a logically complete description of the target phenomenon. In other words, the theory affirms or contains either a sentence A or its logical negation, not A, for every sentence A in the language of the target theory. Any logic experts in the crowd, I'm talking about prime theories. For the rest of us, don't worry about that. All right. The practical upshot of this rule of thumb is avoid gaps in true theories. Next, second one, seek consistent theories. In short, one should seek a logically consistent description of the target phenomenon. In other words, for no sentence A in the language of the theory does the theory affirm, contain both that sentence and its logical negation. The practical upshot, avoid gluts in true theories. The third familiar methodological rule of thumb, seek simple, natural theories. In short, seek the simplest and most natural theory of a given phenomenon. Such methodological rules are not only familiar, they're directly active in the pursuit of true theories, be they in natural science or philosophy or theology or mathematics or etc. Such methodological rules are not logical rules. They're simply practical rules that guide the construction of true theories. Reality, of course, doesn't always bend to the trio of methodological rules. Sometimes one needs to sacrifice simplicity and naturalness in order to accommodate consistency and completeness. Sometimes one must sacrifice completeness in order to accommodate consistency and simplicity, naturalness. Sometimes, as is the case if some contradictory theology is true, one needs to sacrifice consistency in order to accommodate completeness and simplicity, naturalness. The trio of methodological rules strongly governs the construction of true theories. However, when reality is recalcitrant, one does the best one can. Were there a simple rule or algorithm that tells a seeker of truth which of the trio to sacrifice in the face of recalcitrant or otherwise highly perplexing data, the pursuit of true theories would be much, much, much easier than it actually is. Alas, such is the pursuit. Hard. It's very hard. In the end, the running objection that contradictory theology requires abandoning fundamental rules of truth-seeking inquiry should be rejected. The rules are the same now as they've always been. The pursuit of truth is as difficult as it has always been. Theology is not special in that respect. 2, conciliar writers and contradiction. And by the way, conciliar here talks about the councils that sort of form the doctrines of these theological traditions. I think of these doctrines as sort of axioms of the theological theory. But anyway, that's all conciliar means here. And patristic writers are those roughly in the 100 CE to 300. Actually, before the Council of Chalcedon is the way I think of them. I'm not a patristic scholar, so if there are some in the crowd who say it's slightly different from that, go with what they say, not me. But I'm just identifying what I'm talking about in this objection. Okay. Objection. The patristic writers who informed the conciliar documents that at least partially define target Christian theological doctrines, incarnation, Trinity, etc., were entirely unaware of suitable subclassical accounts of logical consequence that make sense of gluts or contradictory theories generally. In turn, the conciliar fathers who wrote target doctrinal texts were obviously not thinking of such accounts of logical consequence, and hence were not thinking about or otherwise entertaining would-be true contradictions in theology. Hence, any contradictory Christian theology is either conspicuously detached from the intentions of conciliar writers or simply getting such intentions wrong. Either way, any would-be contradictory Christian theology should be rejected. Reply. There are at least 4 immediate points of reply. One, as I was saying to Greg before the session started, Some scholars argue that at least some patristic writers advanced contradictory theologies. In particular, Basil Laurie argues that Byzantine patristics advanced contradictory theologies similar to ones advanced more recently. If he's correct, then perhaps Byzantine patristics advanced a contradictory theology absent a fully explicit account of logic that would ground it. Whether he's correct is entirely beyond my competence. I leave his theses, which I assume are fairly controversial among patristic scholars, for proper experts to adjudicate. I mention them here only to flag that at least some scholars, based on historical scholarship, reject the jump from no suitably precise subclassical logic to no contradictory theology. Reply 2. There are other reasons beyond actual historical scholarship for rejecting the inference from no suitably precise subclassical logic to no contradictory theology. For example, the patristics certainly did not have the explicit tools for logic or entailment relations that we enjoy today. However, that alone only makes the truth of apparent contradictory doctrines, divine and human, Trinity, etc., hard to understand. It doesn't imply that such writers had at hand clearly consistent, non-contradictory accounts of what follows from their explicitly written fundamental truths. Another reason to reject said inference concerns divine inspiration and the intentions of the conciliar fathers, and they were fathers at the time. Divine inspiration, usually considered to be active in official conciliar documents, can obviously result in a written record that may be at odds with the very intentions of the given writers. A divinely inspired writer may write something that she intends to be read one way, but the truth, divinely inspired as it is, goes against such intentions. While I'm not here in arguing that this possibility was realized in the actual conciliar documents, the possibility is not wildly remote. It's a possibility that at least slows, if not arrests, the otherwise quick step from an author's historically bound intentions to the actual divinely inspired truth in the document. Finally, and I'm going through this one because this comes up all the time. Maybe it wouldn't come up from this particular crowd, but it comes up a lot. Finally, for present purposes, there's a very natural alternative way of thinking about the core doctrines in conciliar texts, one that diminishes the weight of the ongoing objection. As I see the matter, such writers, divinely inspired, were as puzzled as the rest of us by what they wrote. It's not a case of magically moving pens, as in Harry Potter's discovery of Tom Riddle's schoolboy diary. It's a case of hard thinking and reflection, leading via divine inspiration to apparently contradictory claims. The situation is very common, particularly in theology. The writers recognize that, for example, saying only that Christ is human leaves important truths out. But, on the other hand, saying only that Christ is divine leaves important truths out. And so, divinely inspired, they said both. Even if the result is an apparently contradictory being, namely incarnate God, whose true description is thereby apparently very difficult to understand. The situation is a common one generally, namely writing what is true without understanding exactly why or how it's true. This may be especially common when divine inspiration intervenes in otherwise very parochial intentions and beliefs of historically constrained writers. So for those reasons, that very common objection from conciliar writers to a rejection of contradictory theology should be rejected. Another one, perfection precludes contradiction. Objection, contradiction is a blemish. At the very least, perfection precludes contradiction. Hence, any theology according to which God is perfect is not a contradictory theology. Reply, suppose that the full truth of reality involves truths that are also false. That is, it involves gluts. If that's the way reality is, that's the way reality is. and hence removing the contradictions removes truths of reality. How can that be a blemish? But focus, as the objection does, on perfect aspects of reality. For example, God. Does this change the matter? Not as far as I see. Suppose, as a contradictory theology has it, that the full truth of God involves not just the axiomatic perfection of God, but also some glut, whether it be about God's omniproperties or, in Christian theological work, the incarnation or triune nature of God, or so on. There is no blemish. According to the theology, God is perfect, and axiomatically so. Given that, according to said theology, God is also contradictory, a being of whom some contradiction is true. Divine perfection is clearly compatible with, because realized with, contradiction. The objection, which is categorical, has a comparative cousin, namely that while perfection mightn't preclude contradiction, a non-contradictory being is more perfect, so to speak, than a contradictory being who is alike in all respects to the non-contradictory duplicate, except for a lone contradiction. But why? But the weight of this objection is no heavier than the original version. Why think that because there are more truths, namely some falsehoods, of the otherwise duplicate, why think that because there are more truths of the otherwise perfect duplicate, that the given duplicate is less perfect? Sorry. Argument is required. Pending such argument, the objection, be it in the original categorical version or the comparative version, fails to undermine or diminish contradictory theology. Okay, 4. This too is one of the most common. Analogy and metaphor against contradictory theology. Objection. Contradictory theology is unmotivated, given that apparent contradiction in theology is adequately explained as merely linguistic. As inevitable, linguistic only tangles in the face of God's transcendence. Given God's transcendence, our language, used analogously or in an analogical way, that should be analogically, by the way. Given God's transcendence, our language, used analogically or sometimes metaphorically, only approximates the truth of God. There may be apparent contradictions, but the reality beyond the appearance is not contradictory. Reply. The objection reflects a not uncommon position towards theological theories. The idea is that while apparent contradiction may well emerge, perhaps even inevitably emerge, as some writers actually hold, in theological language, the explanation is not a contradictory being in divine reality, but rather a transcendent being who somehow is overly beyond the reach of our truth-aspiring language. Such a position by Malayites either rejects that theology is a truth-seeking endeavor, or lands in contradiction all the same, or it's arbitrary. Take each horn, so to speak, in turn. Theology, on my view, aims to truly describe reality in the same sense that all truth-seeking activities aim, to truly and fully describe the target reality. In biology, the aim is to give the full truth of biological reality. In mathematics, mathematical reality. In theology, theological, divine reality. That divine reality may exceed what is achievable in theological theories is entirely compatible with the aim of truly describing all of divine reality as far as possible. To my knowledge, there's no particular claim about God that is supposed to be beyond true expression. There's instead a claim about God's full reality going beyond true description. But where? What facet? Without exact details, a gesture towards transcendence as an explanation of why theology can't truly describe God is unfounded. Of course, if theology has no way of truly describing God, then any would-be contradictions fail to be true of God. That's clear. But rejecting that theology truly describes God is rejecting a critical component of serious theological inquiry. At the very least, argument is required for so rejecting. Okay, the second horn, so to speak, is that the position lands in contradiction all the same. This should be obvious and familiar. Claiming that God's transcendence implies that theological language is untrue of God is itself contradictory, entails a contradiction. After all, the predicate is transcendent is true of God, and hence theological language is true of God. Blah. All right, finally, responding to the two horns, so to speak, above, the position according to which the predicate is transcendent is alone true of God is arbitrary. To say that that alone is true of God will get you around the contradiction in the second horn, of course, but it's arbitrary. Why that predicate? Why not others? And notice, parenthetically, that the position may well be unviable, since the predicate is transcendent will itself entail other predicates, each of which, given that they're entailed, is also true of God. So it's not just going to be one predicate true of God and so on. Okay. While the objection reflects a not uncommon position towards theological theories, the position should be rejected in the face of foregoing problems. Accordingly, the objection does not undermine or diminish contradictory theology. All right. 5, God is free of tension. Objection. The very meaning of the term contradiction demands tension or opposition or worse. But any true theology, at least within standard Christian tradition, is one according to which God is free of tension or opposition. Hence, contradictory theology is at best a recipe for theology that pits opposition within God, and therefore is a theology cut away from the traditions in which it purports to reside. Reply. While the etymology of the term may demand as much, and here I say it may demand as much because it's not obvious that to speak against actually demands real tension or opposition. If speak against just means, well, I mean, asserting a negation or something. So while the etymology of the term may demand something like that, the term as used in the present context is tied to its logical usage. In particular, a contradiction per terminology given right at the start is any sentence that entails a sentence of the form, it is true that, and it is false that, where the two truth-falsity operators are logical vocabulary. A glut, as above, is a true and false sentence, which is something that entails a contradiction understood in said logical sense. But then there's nothing in the very meaning of the term contradiction that demands tension or opposition. A true contradiction simply entails a conjunction of two truths, one of which is the logical negation of the other. There's no opposition involved in an arbitrary true contradiction any more than there's opposition in an arbitrary conjunction. Thinking of contradiction as invariably tied to opposition or tension might well explain why contradictory theology, despite its fairly clear virtues, has been neglected. But once the term contradiction is clarified in its logical sense, there's no good reason to tie contradictory theology to opposition. And hence, contrary to the objection, no good reason to tie contradictory theology to would-be opposition or tension in God. Okay. Scripture 6, Scripture in the absence of explicit contradiction. Objection. Contradictory theology confronts a devastating problem if it purports to stand in holy book traditions. For example, in relevant Christian theological tradition, where Christian scripture is taken to record special divine revelation on which much Christian theology is based, the breathtakingly fundamental claim that God is contradictory would, one would reasonably expect, be explicitly given in said text, said holy book. The absence of any such explicit claim of contradiction is very telling. Reply: the appearance of contradiction is rooted in all such sacred texts, at least within the Christian theological tradition. Inasmuch as such, although I would also say in my limited competence in Judaic and Islamic as well, at least with respect to omni stuff and so on. But anyway, I'll stick with my competence. Inasmuch as such scriptures support, as conciliar documents officially declare, that Jesus is not just the Christ, but divine and hence God, the scriptures scream out contradiction. After all, Jesus' ignorance is explicit in said scriptures, where he says, I know not the time of such and so. Ignorance that contradicts the essential omniscience of being God. Indeed, as non-Christian thinkers reflect in such scriptures themselves, the only way to fully square Jesus' recorded actions, including otherwise blasphemous claims like I and the Father are one, etc., is an apparently contradictory one, an interpretation that appeared as nonsense or folly to such non-Christian thinkers, and probably to Christian thinkers too. But put exact exegetical matters aside, in the end, at least Christian theology is partially defined by the doctrines that are supposed to be, by that very tradition, supposed to be Christian scripture based. Those doctrines that by all lights appear to be contradictory are Christian scripture based. The standard appearance of contradiction comes directly from those doctrines as explicitly given. So the apparent contradictions are grounded directly in target scriptures. Okay, two more, and I'll skip the last two because they're not that technical, but they're somewhat technical. All right, theology and logic. Objection. The appearance of contradiction in theology largely rests on apparent entailments from doctrinal claims, from theological axioms. But such entailments are only a threat if true theology is bound by logic or bound by some entailment relation or other. But theology, being directed at the boundless reality of transcendent God, is bound by logic or other entailment relations at its own peril. The peril, in short, is the very apparent contradiction that otherwise arises. The solution is not to accept that true theology is contradictory, and thereby accept that God is a contradictory being. The solution is to jettison the demands of logic or other entailment relations that might otherwise constrain theological claims. By the way, there's precedent for this view by, I think he was largely a theologian, Doms, worked in Canada some years ago. Okay, my reply to this. The objection reflects a position according to which theological claims are detached from whatever it may otherwise entail. In particular, while the doctrinal claims of a particular theology might in fact entail contradiction, such entailments don't affect theology because theology is not closed under any entailment relation, certainly not under logical entailment. Theology is somehow unique among truth-seeking theories in being cut free from the demands of logical consequence, or even extra logical consequence governing the predicates of true theories. That's the position reflected in the objection. Such a position, in my view, should be rejected from the start. Theology may be unique in a variety of ways, but its uniqueness is not a willy-nilly arbitrariness, shirking the demands of logic and other entailment relations, Such a position not only gives up serious and systematic truth-seeking, it sanctions the arbitrary, no rhyme nor reason game of theory construction, where any old set of claims is entirely free from the consequences of the given claims. Okay, let me do one more. Contradiction, paradox, and mystery. Objection. Much of traditional monotheism, and especially Christian theology, is explicitly entwined with central mysteries. The Catholic Church, for example, maintains that Trinitarian reality is a fundamental mystery. Such phenomena often appear to be contradictory, but they are thereby just paradoxes, just apparent contradictions, and not actually contradictory. Accordingly, motivation for contradictory theology is entirely undermined when one accepts instead that target apparent contradictions are pointers towards divine mysteries, not towards actual divine contradiction. Reply. There are various elements of reply. I highlight just two. I do talk about this elsewhere in the books I mentioned, but I'll just highlight two. One, if theological contradiction is strongly apparent, as it is even by the objections light, the question arises, why not simply accept that the reality is contradictory? If the response is that all theological contradictions must be rejected, the response requires argument. Two, the existence of mystery and the appearance of contradiction are very different things, sometimes related, sometimes unrelated. Unless there's very good reason to think that apparent theological contradiction and theological mystery are correlated one-to-one, so to speak, the position according to which apparent contradiction is just a pointer to non-contradictory theological mystery is wanting. In the end, the existence of divine mystery neither undermines nor diminishes contradictory theology. And just before turning it over to Greg and Q&A, I'll mention these last two that are common. One is that the background subclassical logic, that is, it's just slightly weaker than classical logic. Kick out some of the axioms of classical logic and you get to a suitable subclassical one. And one objection is that trying to do modality within this framework is then more complicated. And modality is really important to theology of any tradition. And so the problem is contradictory theology complicates theology because it complicates modality. And I just point out that exactly the standard truth and falsity conditions for standard modal operators remain entirely the same. And then there's a similar sort of logic-y objection that material modus ponens fails, so central conditionals like if you follow Christ, you'll be saved. This doesn't have the implication that Christians think because they can follow Christ all they want. It doesn't follow that they'll be saved and so on. And I just point out that this too is just not a problem. If these are important conditionals to make in the theology, then there are plenty of non-extra logical conditionals that go beyond the material conditional that can make the point and detach. Okay. So the 10 objections canvassed, in my experience, are the most common ones launched against contradictory theology. But for the reasons given, the objections do not undermine or diminish contradictory theologies, at least as they're developed to date. Of course, the development of contradictory theologies remains nascent. Future debate and further exploration is required. I would love to get some help in doing just such exploration from you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It's an exciting topic. I'm really sympathetic to the idea of the contradictory Christ. I might even say I just outright agree with you about it, but get myself into trouble. What that means, though, is something that I'd like to explore, whether we mean the same thing or not. I'm excited to talk about. So we have a lot of questions. Oh, we don't have a lot of questions. We have one question from YouTube. Maybe I'll start with the YouTube question, if that's okay, and then we can go to Ryan next, if that's all right. Okay, so here's the question from YouTube. It's in the chat, so you can also read along here. Do you see tension or conflict between your methodological rules of thumb and your response to the, quote, perfection precludes contradiction objection? It seems like you are saying that we ought to seek consistent and complete theories, and yet you are also arguing that divine perfection is found in contradiction, incarnation, and Trinity. Not only is contradiction not an imperfection, is the objection, it is perfection itself. Witness the Christian God. So why should our methodology consider inconsistency subpar or less than ideal when perfection itself is contradictory? Does that make any sense? Sorry if it does not.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I take it the question is, I said that we're not abandoning the standard trio of methodological rules of inquiry. Those are that we should seek consistent theories, we should seek complete theories, and simple theories, and so on. But I'm also saying that divine perfection does not preclude contradiction. That perfection itself, divine or otherwise, doesn't preclude contradiction. And the question asks about a tension between having a methodological rule that tells you to construct consistent theories, and one that says perfection doesn't preclude contradiction. Yeah, well, the methodological rules don't reflect a general, I mean, they're not based on some a priori normative principle about, that you're going to derive that consistency are the only good theories and complete ones are the only good ones, and so on. These are genuinely sort of methodological rules that govern inquiry as a matter of fact. And they've done a good job. I mean, many true theories that we've constructed, whether it's in physics or biology or mathematics or what have you, metaphysics, whatever you want, these have been consistent and complete. I don't know about simple, but yeah. So if these methodological rules of thumb were being put forth based on some sort of a priori argument about the normative weight of contradiction and completeness and this and that, then there would be a tension. But I don't, they're not put forward that way. These are more like almost sort of good rules of practice. It's like, why do you put a roof on last when you're building a house or building a shed? Well, it's not because there's some badness in doing some different order. It's rather that, hey, it works, it works well. Now, sometimes you have to put a roof on before you do other things. But those are going to be the exception. These rules are much the same. Keep going forward in the standard way. And when reality pushes back, well, deal with it. That's pretty much the way truth seeking has been for forever. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question, but I do see the question, and I think it's assuming that there's some normative contradiction bad, so seek consistent theories. No, these rules are more like keep seeking consistency, completeness, and simplicity. You're not always going to get it, but try. Why? Well, it's worked. It's worked before. Why stop? I mean, so it's a very pragmatic thing.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we'll see if the questioner also has a response or wants to follow up later. Ryan, please, floor is yours for your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Beall. It's wonderful to hear from you. I've been reading your work for quite some time, and I'm fascinated by it. I hosted a conference on Trinitarian ontology in 2019, where we invited quite a lot of continental philosophers of religion to speak about this subject. So I'm eager to dive into your responses to the work of analytic theologians. What I want to ask, however, is about the notion of contradiction as not involving opposition. So I'm curious about most of your objections, but the one that I'm most fascinated by is the answer that you've given in 4 or 5, which is that God is free of tension. And in your written paper, you write that there's nothing in the very meaning of contradiction that demands tension or opposition. A true contradiction simply entails a conjunction of two truths. There's no opposition involved in arbitrary true contradiction any more than there's opposition in arbitrary conjunction. Now, I should point out 2 things. First of all, in the etymology of contradiction, antilogia, there's a notion of opposition. Second, in Aristotle's on interpretation, he frames contradiction as a specific way of framing a form of contrariety or opposition between 2 statements. And then the third point is, and this I think is the most relevant one, is that until modern mathematical logic, where following Bernard Brazzano, propositions could be spoken as sentences in themselves, there was the standard form of logic that was inherited from Antoine Arnauld and from Immanuel Kant and from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, conceived of contradictions precisely in terms of opposition between concepts. And this was essential both to Kant's antinomies of reason as well as to the dialectical tension between concepts in Hegel in the logic. So I wonder how one could escape from that in a phenomenological sense, if not even in a mathematical sense.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd like to say it's a bummer that that Trinity book is in press now, because it would have been interesting to see some of the work that came out of your conference. Let me also request that if you could send me some notes via email on the question. This applies to everyone. That would be super helpful. Obviously, you'd be doing me a favor. There's no obligation, obviously. Okay. So I tried to mention that etymologically I think I mentioned in the current written version, this is the first draft, that the etymology may demand some sort of opposition, but then I flag, it's not obvious to me that it's, I should say, important opposition or tension. What do I mean by that? Well, even the sort of anti, right, speaking against, against sounds like it's opposition, but is it relevant opposition? I mean, when the worry is that a contradictory theology is imposing opposition within God, well, I mean, it doesn't have to be God. It's just obviously in these standard theologies, you don't want to think of God. Well, let me not say that, because I think that there are arguments all over the place for actual opposition, but let's suppose that God is supposed to be opposition free, right? Perfect being, can't sort of be in tension or something. Okay. The etymology to me, the sense of against, the sense of oppose, which contrariety just borrows. These are just claims about entailments, like back and forth. To me, that's not real opposition in any relevant or important sense. It's just entailment. So when speak against, you say, well, how can you speak against yourself? there's two obvious answers. One is, well, you assert the negation of something you said. And that's often thought to be somehow against in this other sense, namely that you're fighting yourself. That's, to me, that's just a non sequitur. I mean, I would love to be corrected. Not on this. So I defer to the scholars. Like, I just have no competence there. But just like on the truth of the matter, I would love to be corrected. But I just see it as a non sequitur. So the etymology may demand, okay, you know, a contradiction is talk against but what does the against mean? That's the critical question. And okay, I feel like I'm repeating myself, so I want to invite you to ask a follow-up, if you will. But do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's clearly, if against is just asserting the negation, okay, but that's then the objection that contradictory theology posits a tension or opposition in God is sort of, okay, it's true, but so what? I mean, so what? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested in this, and I'm going to be responding in detail in the paper that I'm giving later this morning. So I'll say more about it later. But the specific point of my objection was not simply etymological, but genealogical. That is, it was asking about the origin of the notion of contradiction, and also if there's a more generic sense of contradiction that precedes that of modern mathematical logic, in which the way that we analyze the contradiction involves merely formal entailment, that it involves no phenomenal opposition between concepts. And I was simply pointing out that for early modern logic, up until Hegel and Bradley, arguably, that contradiction had been framed in terms of phenomenal opposition between concepts, and that this was a more primitive sense that harkens back to the notion of contradiction that we find in Aristotle and Plato. And I was recommending this as an alternative way of thinking about it that can't simply be ignored. But it seems like you have a very good reason for jettisoning it.
Oh, no, not jettisoning it, but just being clear that I'm not using it in that way. But I'm ignorant of that. So by phenomenal, but so when people say opposition of concepts, I truly don't know what they mean. But I mean, do you mean something like I don't know, what are two colors that can't be together? Can you give me an example? I always forget.
Black and white.
Okay, so black and white. So so you know, but sorry, I guess what I mean is, okay, let it be black and white. So they sort of are opposed to one another. Yeah, I mean, so when I say opposed there, I just mean, so I do think it's probably true. I mean, let the color experts in physics tell us, but I do think it's true that if the predicate black is true of something, use fully black or however we need to sort of tweak it, is true of something, that entails, and here's the opposition, that the predicate fully white is untrue of that thing. Yeah, that yes. But again, this is not opposition in that sense. This is yeah, I mean, look, how about this to capture what you're doing? By the way, I'm not arguing the historical point. I very much would like to see your paper. But how about this? So I tend to say, somewhat against the standard usage of contraries, subcontraries, and all that. I tend to say the contrary predicates are predicates that are jointly exemplified only if some contradiction is true. I would say that of our predicates black and white, however you have to tweak them to make them work. So they are exemplified by something only if some contradiction is true of that something. Is that enough opposition for your phenomenal opposition or whatever?
Yes, that certainly helps.
Okay, but yours is your phenomenal opposition is or whatever. Maybe I misunderstood. Your historical precedent for this sort of more logical notion is different from what I just said, though, right? Or no?
Yes, it is. So I think the classical account that I derived from Plato and Aristotle would hold that first of all, the terms we use to refer to things come before the way in which we negate or oppose them. And then secondly, that the negation is an expression of their difference, which can also be a difference of opposition, by which, as it were, two terms stand in a conflictual or mutually diminishing relation to one another. So in the case of black and white, black would be diminished if it became white, and vice versa. White would become diminished if it became black. You would have shades of gray between them. You would only have a sheer contradiction if you had it where, as you said, fully black and fully white, and those were held to be mutually exclusive. But the exclusivity is, as it were, a product of a sheer divide that admits for no middle between them.
Okay. By the way, for what it's worth, I mean, that sounds very much like a degree theoretic, or at least you need degree theoretic tools in giving the full account of what you're doing there. Well, look, I very much would like to see your paper, so thanks.
Okay, thanks for that exchange. Just a note from the person who asked the question on YouTube. His name was Michael DeVito, so I'll give him a name, and he says, "Excellent response, thank you." So that's his response. Further questions from other people on Zoom? I have some questions, but I will wait to the end if others have questions they'd like to ask first. Okay, so I have 3 questions, but I'll just ask one, and if other people have questions, then I will cede the floor to them. I also had a question following Ryan's question about opposition, but maybe since we've been talking about that for a bit, I'll put that to the side, and if we have time, we'll come back to it. I wanted to ask about the simple and natural rule first, that this account of say Christ as a true contradiction or contradictory theology is more simple and more natural than other accounts, other forms of Christology. And this seems right in a certain way, like we don't have to appeal to any kind of very complicated, implausible metaphysical theories about Christ to account for the apparent contradiction. We just accept it. So there's less maneuvering, kind of conceptual maneuvering on our part. We're just honest about what's happening. Okay, but what I'm wondering is, what's the, would it not be more simple? And I'm also wondering what exactly these terms mean, because being a Hegel scholar, I'm maybe sometimes a bit suspicious of simplicity. Okay, so but let me ask, wouldn't it be simpler to just get rid of Jesus Christ as the God human? Wouldn't that really, I mean, first, sure, if we accept there is such an incarnated God, maybe this is simpler, but if we're going to treat theology like we treat all these other disciplines, and this is one of the common threads, which I do appreciate, you're not setting theology aside as this special area where entailments don't work and this kind of thing, but wouldn't it just be simpler to get rid of the God-man completely? That Jesus Christ complicates a lot.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's
I know this is a deeper question. I mean, I'm really going to the source here, as kind of
Well,
pushing a step
so
back. Yeah.
right, so absolutely, but so I mischaracterized what's going on. So the idea is you take the doctrines as given.
Yeah. Right. And this is how theology works. Yeah.
Exactly.
Of course.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 And so you take them as given, but I am interested as a philosopher, not just as a theologian, and as a person,
Right.
and who's an inquiry-seeking person, is the kind of acceptance of this axiom or this dogmatic feature.
Well,
Wondering if you're able to speak to that in any way, or if this is just where the buck stops.
well, no, I mean, I think, like, the whole, so within philosophy of religion and within sort of so focusing just on my area of competence, philosophy of Christian religion, a big thing is so-called apologetics.
Yes.
Which is to defend well, it's twofold, right? It's to defend the truth or the coherence of this stuff, but the other is to actually give positive arguments for the truth of these things. And I think that's I think that there is no positive argument that can ever be given that doesn't beg the question for any of these axioms.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's unique to theological theories, but I think it's certainly true of theological theories. So when people go to argue for the truth of these axioms, I've never seen one ever.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Since I have the floor, I'll just keep asking you since I have a list. Okay. So my second question has to do with kind of an interesting consequence that happens once we allow that there can be true contradictions. These contradictions can be successfully articulated and evaluated in our language. One of the questions that has come up to me that really stood out as you went through all the objections is the question of what do we do with claims, or what would you do? How would you explain or talk about the inexpressibility of God, or the fact of God's say transcending what we could know? Because one traditional way of doing that is to say, when we try to grasp the Godhead, we find, or the incarnate God, we find God or Christ is finite and not finite. And so we fall into paradox, or we say God is maybe a violation of excluded middle, like neither A nor not A. And so there's an unknown. So we can have a glut or a gap kind of encounter, and then we say it's unknown. And so maybe just focusing on the glut moment or the contradiction here. The inexpressibility is often tied to, and I know you're critical of that, tied to the encounter with contradiction, which indicates that there's something we're not getting because we fall into contradiction. So what I'm interested in is, how do you have thoughts about how to rethink the inexpressibility of certain aspects of the divine, or how do you rethink the God's surplus in respect to our knowledge? Do you have thoughts about this specifically? Because maybe they're not tied one-to-one, but what is it? How are we to understand even that experience, for example? Because, so yeah, this is, I'm
so
hoping.
So I think I get where you're going, or where you're coming from anyhow. So in these two, analytic theology books, I touch on something around this. I don't have the competence, though I would love to study the sort of mystics and stuff. even just as a logician, because it strikes me, as I'm sure it strikes most people, that, you know, like think about the negative way and all this stuff, right? It just looks contradictory, or it looks gappy. But then if it's gappy, then what are you asserting there? What are you saying? So I think, I mean, maybe there has been work, but I think that is such an enormously interesting area for exploration, just from a logical perspective, trying to give an account of what's going on there. Okay. So yeah, I mean, talk of transcendence, like I said, it looks like it's contradictory. You can do it all sorts of different ways to sort of reduce the contradiction. But I think ultimately it looks, in the way that it gets used, it looks contradictory.
Yeah. I would agree that.
I mean, think about it this way. Even if you don't have language, even if you say that the language, much of language is true of God, or whatever you want, posit some transcendent being, that you say the language is true of it in some ways. But clearly there are many things that are what, neither true nor false, or what of the thing. Where do you get that? Like, where you have to have enough entailments from the original beyond us attribution to get all these things that are supposed to be beyond. But if you've got that entailment, then how is it that this thing can't, you know? So I just think I think it's a real mess.
Yeah.
But I will say something else I talk about in that. So you mentioned the very experience of this sort of thing. I'm not wedded to this, but one thing that I talked briefly about in one of these books is obvious, certainly in the Christian tradition, you know, the talk of needing faith to, you know, see the truth and stuff. I pointed out that if the truth is contradictory, right, that is both P and not P for some are true of some of divine reality or the incarnation, just let it be that. Then believing the truth may well be incredible in the literal sense of that term. It may well be that you cannot define the term fully believe. You fully believe P just when you believe P all at once, so to speak. Now let P be a contradiction, Q and not Q, right? Then if that's some fundamental truth about the incarnation, you might literally not be able to fully believe it. Because every time you go to believe P, you sort of are shoved off from right now, before my mind, believing its negation. Or when you believe the negation, you're sort of shoved off of believing the negatum. So, the question about the experience of this kind of thing, again, I would love to have the time and to dive into sort of the mystics, if only for the logical richness of it. Because I think they might have had something like that going in mind, trying to pull the two together. Anyway.
There's an interesting kind of psychological component as well that's correlated with the logical and the form of language. So I think that's also very interesting, and to see how the psychology of belief and contradiction. Just one last comment before we go on to Sam, and I'll leave my third question for the end. Is just a comment on the the kind of contradictory theology that we see there in the tradition that's been there for some time. You have the contradictory theology of Kierkegaard, who just takes on that Christ is finite and infinite. And of course, he's not a logician and he's not doing the kind of theology that you're doing, but the idea for him, of course, is the leap of faith, at least one of the leaps is the belief that here we have this finite infinite God-man, and that this leap of faith, the knight of faith takes this leap when it seems impossible, but he does it anyway, and on the strength of the absurd, right? So I know you're saving Christ from the absurd here, but you have a contradictory theology that's there. And then, of course, you keep going back all the way back to, we looked back to Dermot Moran's talk yesterday. Now, it wasn't clear at the end of it whether, in fact, Origena holds that God is contradictory or not, but at least we find in your language gaps, a lot of God is neither finite nor infinite. This is an absolute negation. So God is not just nothing as opposed to being, but God is, or the negation opposed to something, but the negation of affirmation and negation, right? So a kind of absolute negation, a neither nor, neither infinite nor finite. So you have this absolute gap language. And then you also, in Origena, this is very early medieval stuff, you also have the gluts all over. God is and is not, right? And so you have, and then often there is a transition from the total gap, the neither nor, to the both and. And that's really common in the mystical tradition. In my own talk, I'll talk about this, the way Eckhart goes from neither nor to both and. And neither nor to both and is a kind of a way of thinking that you'll see from God in transcending every determination, has every determination. God in having no name has every name. So this kind of thinking from the radical gap to the radical glut is a really common trope and feature of mystical theology in the West, and the contradictions are arguably all over the place. So it's interesting to think about your work in connection to this, because it's another variety of contradictory theology, is what it is. It's another variety of
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Really good. Yeah.
So just a comment. Sam.
Yeah, following up on what Greg said, I have to admit that I'm not a logician, so I appreciate the kind of constructive work you're doing. I work in historical theology at a seminary. And so I'll give you a little bit perspective of my feedback on your talk. On the one hand, but this doesn't entail my question, the kinds of Christians I'm around, more of an evangelical variety, Protestants, I think their response to you would be more in the logic of faith, in terms of like, and they wouldn't say logic of faith, but just, I know you're writing for theologians but I think some of my students would think more about, I just believe based on the revealed word, and I don't have to, faith is believing something I hear, not what I see. And thinking about this is pushing more towards that sight that you don't have in this life. Anyways, that's an aside of saying, like, how do you deal with that, like fideism or whatever, where those types of people who do theology just from believing and thinking too much is philosophy and a problem. Okay, so that's like maybe a more popular critique. On the other hand, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards, if you get any feedback where people say, what about the coincidence of opposites or the coincidence of contradictions? And for instance, Nicholas of Cusa speaks about the coincidence of opposites in Jesus as the coincidence of opposites, the maximal, the minimal, the finite, the infinite. And he talks about mystical theology as in his treatise on the vision of God. He's leading these monks towards the darkness of mystical theology, which is mental vision of God. He says that there's this wall of paradise that is the law of non-contradiction. And you have to, I don't know if he says leap, but I have Kierkegaard in my head here from Greg. You have to leap beyond this wall of non-contradiction towards like a mental vision of infinity beyond the coincidence of opposites. And so he doesn't say God is the coincidence of opposites, but God, the reality of God's infinity lies beyond that. And it is intellectual. And it is, so I don't know. I mean, obviously, you don't have to speak particularly to Cusanus and what he has to say. He might be an interesting dialogue partner because he talks explicitly throughout his theology as mystical theology involving the coincidence of opposites. I don't know if you have anything to say, like, what's the difference between contradiction and just saying God entails, like, God is a contradiction, Jesus is a contradiction, and saying that Jesus is like the coincidence of opposites?
Well, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, really, really helpful. What the difference is between saying contradiction, coincidence of opposites, depends obviously very, very much on exactly what we mean by coincidence and opposite. But the way you sort of rehearsed coincidence of infinite and finite and so on like that, I mean, I don't know how that can't come to a contradiction. So it may be the way to talk is in terms of, at least, yeah, to some, some traditions, maybe in terms of the coincidence of opposites. But I just haven't thought of it until you said it. But I guess in some sense, so the arguments I give in the Contradictory Christ, which are sort of presupposed in this follow-up divine contradiction on the Trinity, the arguments there actually take something like, that the divine nature entails being, okay, I'm going to say, I don't actually say this in the book, but just because it's on the table, divine nature entails being infinite. Human nature entails being finite. And, you think of the heresies as ways around these, trying to get around the contradictions. One's like, well, you're not really human, you're just God looking human, or this or that. It's a way of getting around the genuine, now I'm using your terminology, coincidence of opposites. I would say it's sort of a way of getting around the coincidence of contradictories. But the only way around it is the truth of the contradiction. That's the case whether it's theological reality or non-theological reality. If there's some contradictory entity or piece of reality, the only way around it is to either ignore half the truth or to accept the contradiction. It's just the way it is with these things. But I like that. Yeah. Okay.
You had a first question as well, though, right? It was different from the. Oh no, it was just a comment.
It was more just a comment on a more gut level reaction to logic of contradiction of just the average believer. For me, in my context of saying, well, I just believe in Jesus as God based on faith. And so that's how faith works for me, or experience, I'd appeal to experience, but faith for them is very much like, you don't have to push towards, so it's obviously a not analytic theology.
Right. Yeah, you said you're at a seminary, Sam?
Yes.
Where's the seminary?
It's in Hong Kong. It's a Lutheran theological seminary in Hong Kong.
Oh, okay. How close is that to Greg's,
Quite close.
Yeah, he's
right.
down the
Okay.
street. Yeah, we have a mysticism circle that we do every month, and someone shares a text on mystical theology from different traditions, and we discuss them informally. So Sam led a discussion. And
mystically, I hope.
We try, but we don't want to push our agenda onto anyone who isn't.
Yeah.
One shouldn't do this kind of thing. No, yeah. So Sam led a discussion on Luther and pseudo-Dionysus last time.
Oh man, wow, that would be great. Look, Notre Dame has a pot full of gold, as you might imagine, from the Irish, and contact me. We should get you over here and just do a fun workshop. That would be really nice to talk about that stuff. But contact me offline. Yeah. Ryan has a.
Ryan, please.
I just wanted to briefly add, as Douglas Headley could easily have narrated yesterday, there's a very direct and well-documented genealogy between Plato, between Plotinus, and Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite through Eriugena to Cusa, that comes variously from Cusa's reception of Eriugena, as well as his reading of Proclus, as well as his reading of Eriugena's translation of Pseudo-Dionysius. All of these authors are sort of coming together in Cusa. He's very much a kind of great medieval synthesizer of this entire paradoxical tradition that comes down from Plato and Parmenides.
I just want to make the request again, and I admit it's selfish, but I hope that these various comments, you might be able to email me even just snippets of it, because this is all very like good for me and for my work. So thank you. And I mean, that's to Sam and Greg as well.
So we're almost out of time. Let me just maybe I'll ask one final question very quickly. It relates to this critique that when you say of Christ that there's a true contradiction, that you're imposing some opposition, for example, in God. And God is simple and free of opposition. Okay. Now, I think one of the ways that this argument could be improved, this critique could be improved, is if you think about true and false as ways of being, ways of saying being. And this is, if you look in Aristotle, we spoke about this yesterday. Aristotle, in Book Delta of the Metaphysics, has all the ways of saying being. True and false these are ways of saying being and non-being, right? So what happens is, if you say it's true, right, and false true of Christ that he's finite, and false that he's finite because he's infinite or something, that saying that it's true and false that Christ is such and such is a way of saying then about God himself, that he is being and non-being. And so it may be that from this kind of traditional understanding of what is being asserted when we talk about truth, that we would end up attributing a kind of opposition to God himself. But it's not a position that you would have to take, of course. But I wonder if this is something that may be going on, or if that would be one way of making the objection stronger.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it does. I think, again, the issues that Ryan brought up are going to, we need to address again. So I myself think that there's we often, when we talk about exemplification of a property, we often talk as if there's just one exemplification relation. But I actually think that there's two. You truly exemplify, or you can falsely exemplify. And along those lines, one way of hearing what you're saying is absolutely fine, no opposition. But to say something that something's true and false, a predicate is true and false of God, requires that God somehow exists as that, and what
Does not exist.
Have non-being with respect to that. I don't know, but there's a way in which that's all okay. It just depends on what's really going on here. I'm not seeing opposition in that.
Okay.
Being and non-being. After all, how are you going to oppose non-being? There's nothing to oppose. How's non-being going to oppose being? Well, there's some. we'd have to get to sort of clarify all this language before knowing exactly,
Sure,
the
sure.
full bunch of some of this stuff. But yeah, well, thank you all for the questions. I really appreciate it, and I do hope you'll send some by email. My email address is that. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk, and thanks everybody for the excellent discussion and for the excellent questions. So thanks once again. And I suppose, yeah, please, everyone send your comments, your thoughts to JC Beall, and we will take a short break. And then at 9:45, I'll give a talk on Truth and Contradiction in Meister Eckhart. And then we'll take a longer lunch break. So there's been a slight change to the schedule. So I hope that doesn't throw anybody off too much. Okay, so I'll hopefully see you all at 9:45. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, I think we can get started. It's 9:46, so we'll try to stay on time here.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Frank, an MPhil student here at CHK. As Greg is speaking in this section, I will first take the floor to introduce him. Professor Gregory Morse is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at CHK, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research is mainly about metaphysics and epistemology, Kant and post-Kantian German philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, and also philosophy of religion. Including Meister Eckhart and also the comparative mysticism. And today's topic is truth and contradiction in Meister Eckhart. So Greg, please.
Thanks a lot, Frank, for introducing me. So I did not have to introduce myself. Okay, so today the talk is on truth and contradiction in Meister Eckhart. And it's a draft, some reflections, so any feedback is welcome. The paper is a mix of exegesis of arguments as well as some reflections of my own that are motivated by Meister Eckhart's thinking. So without further ado, in his On the Incarnation, St. Athanasius famously wrote that God became man so that man may become God. This insight has significant relevance for Meister Eckhart, for whom the fact of the incarnation of God in human flesh is a prime motivation for his mystical theology. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ instructs his disciples to be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. God lacks nothing and is thereby perfect. In referring to himself, God says, "I am that I am." Eckhart reads this as an identification of God with being as such, without further qualification. Because God is perfection, to become perfect, one must become God. Becoming perfect, moreover, means to become indistinguishable from being itself. In order to fulfill the commandment to be perfect, one must achieve a mystical union. Eckhart reasons that the fact that God became incarnate in the person of Jesus demonstrates the possibility of the union of God and the human being. God and the human being can become one because they have become one in the person of Christ. As Pseudo-Dionysius says, quote, "God is the source of perfection for those being made perfect, source of divinity for those being deified," close quote. We see the kind of echoes or origins of this theology in Paul echoes this theology of incarnation when he calls on his followers to put on Christ. Eckhart radicalizes this theology in On Detachment. He says, "And you must know that when Christ became man, it was not just the human being he put on himself. He put on human nature. Therefore, do you too go out of all things, and then there will be only what Christ accepted and put on, until you will have put on Christ," close quote. The doctrine of Athanasius goes by theosis. Theosis signifies a process of deification. Eckhart's theology of theosis is not only influenced by early church fathers, but also by the Neo-Platonic philosophy of Pseudo-Dionysius, for whom theosis is indisputably central to Christian practice. Pseudo-Dionysius speaks of, quote, "the union of divinized minds with the light," close quote, and the, quote, "many who are raised so far as they can be to divinization," close quote. For Eckhart, the indivisibility of being is engendered in the very concept of being itself. When one claims that X is or Y is, one does not distinguish between X or Y. To say of either subject that it is does not differentiate the subject. Long before Heidegger, Meister Eckhart critiqued ontotheology by recognizing that being cannot be a being. And of course, this doesn't really begin with him either. Since being is indistinct, being offers no resources by means of which one could in principle differentiate one kind of thing from another. What kinds of things there are cannot be known or derived from simply thinking about being itself, or so it seems. From being itself, one cannot arrive, it seems, at a being, understood as a particular instance of being, namely as a differentiated instance of being, this or that. Because being itself is indistinct, and God is being, God is indistinct. We find a first contradiction in the ontological constitution of God's being as nothing. Indistinct being entails that God is nothing. Since God is indistinct, and indistinct being is not a thing, God is no thing. Because God is indistinct, God offers no principle in virtue of which he could be made distinguishable from nothing at all. Thus, the indivisible oneness of God should entail that God is nothing. So Eckhart says God is a, quote, transcending nothingness, close quote. Since indistinct being is no being, the only way one can successfully express the being of God is to proclaim the truth of the first ontological contradiction, quote, being is nothing. This articulation is another contradiction. It's epistemic. It's the knowing of the ontological contradiction, the claim that being is nothing. So this concerns human knowledge of God. Because the conceptual domain is governed by the principle of non-contradiction, or so it appears, according to which no contradiction can be true, in order to know God whose being is constituted by a contradiction, it seems that one must transcend all concepts. Pseudo-Dionysius writes that, quote, we must not dare to resort to words or conceptions concerning that hidden divinity which transcends being, close quote. Eckhart states that if you do not want to be brutish, do not understand God who is beyond words, close quote. Reason is, quote, an inferior power because it is discretion. In the soul that knows God, there dwells a simple silence. But what is meant by reason is discretion. All the conceptual knowing differentiates its object. When one predicates a concept of a subject, one differentiates the subject according to the predicate and distinguishes it from the negation of that predicate. The human being as a mammal entails it is false, the human being is not a mammal. Such a discretionary knowing invokes comparisons, but being is beyond all comparisons. What is more, knowing God seems to require successful theosis. Theosis requires the human being, in the case of Eckhart, not just to express the contradiction in words, but to become it. The human being ought to be nothing. Eckhart radicalizes Dionysius by arguing that it is by way of detachment from differentiated or distinct being that the human being can become divine. Detachment is justified by the undifferentiated or indistinct nature of the Godhead. Given that being does not differentiate, in order to become divine, the human being must become indistinct. In order to become the indistinct being, one must abandon conceptualizing. Simply put, the truth of God's being can only be expressed, it seems, in the form of contradiction, which, although this should be true, cannot be known as true from the position of reason, since reason should not acknowledge true contradictions. As a result, one ought not attempt to understand God with words which express concepts. Rather, one should express the truth of contradiction by expressing, it seems, nothing. Or to put it in contradictory terms, one ought to express the contradiction by a non-expressive expression, a silent expression. Although becoming indistinct engenders transcending all opposition and thereby transcending the possibility of contradiction, this truth, it seems, can only be conceptually expressed as contradiction. And it is the contradiction here, the identity of the term with its negation, that most truly corresponds with the condition that is beyond all opposition. Here again, Eckhart draws upon Pseudo-Dionysius. In order to become divinized, one must, quote, transcend all things, deny all beings, and cease from all intelligent activity, close quote. The proper way to know God is immediately in a kind of intellectual understanding, which is direct knowing without any medium or comparisons. Since indistinct being cannot be known through a medium except by making it distinct, the way to know indistinct being would be to know it immediately. In immediate knowing, the human being no longer relates to its object through something else, for this is the meaning of mediation. Accordingly, for Eckhart, knowing being means that one must become being. The immediate relation to being in the understanding seems to be nothing other than becoming identical to that with which one stands in relation. Regarding detachment, Eckhart writes that, quote, all it wants is to be, but to wish to be this or that thing, this it does not want. Whoever wants to be this or that wants to be something, but detachment wants to be nothing at all, close quote. What is more, God is detachment. Quote, God has it from his immovable detachment that he is God. And it is from his detachment that he has his purity, his simplicity, and his unchangeability. Since God is detachment, the way to become equal with God is through detachment itself. Since being is without distinction, being is detached from all distinct beings. Thus, in order to realize theosis, one must become detached from all distinct beings or creatures. Usually, we identify ourselves as this or that being, and we conceive of ourselves as distinct beings by means of various representations. Detachment requires the human being to let go of these representations of a self distinct from being. Through this ego suicide, the human being allows God to enter into the soul. In this way, Eckhart interprets Paul's mystical saying, "I live and yet I live not, Christ lives in me," as claiming that he no longer exists as a being separate from God. Accordingly, detachment is a process of letting go of the conception of one's own ego as a being separate from God. Here again, Eckhart follows to Dionysius, for whom, quote, "By an undivided and absolute abandonment of yourself and everything, you will be uplifted to the ray of the divine shadow, which is above everything that is," close quote. Although here we have perhaps a radicalization of this idea of theosis, whereby it's not just participation in the divine rays or the divine energies, but it seems that it's a kind of identity that's taking place in Eckhart's thought. Eckhart provocatively identifies detachment and thereby God with nothing. In Sermon 83, Eckhart writes, "How should I love him? Quote, you should love him as he is a non-God, a non-spirit, a non-person, a non-image, but as he is a pure, unmixed, bright one, separated from all duality. And in that one, we should eternally sink down out of something into nothing." I believe this is a quote that Dermot also cited yesterday. In detachment, one separates from a conception of God as a distinct thing. Now, detachment approaches so closely to nothingness, quote, that there can be nothing between perfect detachment and nothingness, close quote. For Eckhart, God is nothingness. If I say God is a being, it is not true. He is, quote, being transcending being and a transcending nothingness, close quote. So here we have also the hyperousia. Ousia is also connected to nothingness itself. In a profound turn of events, by becoming detached from all comparative beings, one not only becomes detached from oneself as a separate being, but one becomes detached from the absolute as a separate being. As Eckhart writes, quote, "So therefore let us pray to God that we may be free of God," close quote. At the outset of the quest for theosis, God or the absolute may stand opposed to the human being as a divine other, the Lord and creator of the world. Via detachment, the human being breaks through God of the creatures and becomes nothing. Detachment wants to be, and this is no different from wanting nothing at all. Accordingly, for Eckhart, God is God understood as a being that stands in relation to other things. And this God exists for those who have not yet detached, not yet seen the true essence of the Godhead, who is absolutely nothing. Becoming God means breaking through the God to the Godhead, the essence of God as nothing. Quoting Eckhart, if my life is God's being, then God's existence must be my existence, and God's isness is my isness, neither less nor more, close quote. For Eckhart, those who are equal to nothing, quote, they alone are equal to God, close quote. Eckhart tells us that it is exactly in virtue of God's transcendence that God is immanent in all things. As indistinct, God cannot be compared with or separated from anything. Although being appears to transcend all beings, this is what we just said, this cannot be the whole truth. Insofar as being is the undifferentiated nothing, it cannot be differentiated from any particular being whatsoever. It's indistinct, so it can't be different from what is distinct. This is the key dialectical idea. For Eckhart, being as nothing cannot be distinguished from any differentiated beings. As Eckhart teaches, quote, therefore God is free of all things, and therefore he is all things, close quote. So you're free of all things, and this entails that you are all things. As a result, we arrive at another apparent contradiction. I would just think that it actually is one. Yeah. Third contradiction, being is differentiated insofar as it is undifferentiated. As Dionysius proclaims, he has come down to be at our level of nature and has become a being in an act of kenosis. This dialectical result is confirmed in pseudo-Dionysus in the case of language as well. So this isn't necessarily unique to Eckhart, this dialectic, as was already noted in the comments, but nonetheless, a beautiful argument, I think. In the divine names, the dialectical result is confirmed in the case of language. Insofar as God is nothing, he's also everything and is therefore designated by every name. Quote, the theologians praise it by every name and as the nameless one. So we have this nameless one, there's every name in the domain of words, and then we also have the non-being and the every being in the kind of ontological. And then we have this, it seems, correlation between these two. Given that God is simultaneously differentiated and undifferentiated, God's identity with creation can only be described by means of a word beyond speech. As undifferentiated, God is beyond all concepts, because all concepts are differentiated. But as differentiated, God belongs to the domain of concepts. Quote, thus regarding the divine unity, this is pseudo-Dionysus, beyond being, they assert it's wholly belonging to the conceptual realm, because it must. Wholly belonging, the assertion of all things, the denial of all things, that which is beyond every assertion and every denial, close quote. The Gospel of John instructs us that in the beginning was the Word. This logos is an absolute or divine reason. And mysticism engenders going beyond one's own words into a simple silence. But as Eckhart says, this enables a different kind of speech. By closing one's mouth, one allows God to open his. Accordingly, through perfect detachment, speech returns as a kind of contradictory speech, a divine logos. The truth itself speaks, not Eckhart. This human silence seems to be a correlate of divine speech. A cataphatic arises again out of the truth of the apophatic. And this true contradiction seems to be a kind of absolute middle where the cataphatic and the apophatic meet, a kind of apocataphatic. Indeed, Eckhart is clear that through detachment, the human being becomes a vessel through whom God speaks. The human being is as a blank writing tablet who erases his own word in order that God might write his. Okay, so briefly, I've just spoken about kind of three contradictions: this identity of being and nothing, the articulation of this identity, and then the transformation of the indistinct being to the distinct being, the identity of the indistinct and the distinct, and the transition from one to the other out of indistinction itself. Now I'd like to talk about a few other ideas. The three loci of contradiction that I've spoken about in Eckhart can also raise questions about a number of other important concepts that I want to briefly talk about: Holy Trinity, incarnation, freedom, ecstasy, and agape. Okay, so first, starting with Trinity. Because God as nothing cannot be differentiated from the world of particular beings and thereby cannot stand opposed to them, the differentiated beings as a complete class of differentiated things do not stand in any differentiated relation to anything beyond themselves. For this reason, the domain of differentiated beings itself is indistinct. Insofar as the absolute differentiates itself into differentiated beings, it returns to itself out of this differentiated state. Thus, the absolute can be constituted by a threefold movement: God qua indistinct one, God qua differentiated being, and God as the unity of the indistinct and the distinct. And each of these can be identified as a moment of the Trinity: the Father, the indistinct being, the Son, the indistinct made distinct, and a reconciliation of the distinct with the indistinct in the Holy Spirit. Eckhart follows Dionysus's claim that the God is multiplied and yet remains singular, close quote. And here we have a creation out of nothing that also becomes a creation out of God himself. This is something also that Dermot Moran also spoke about yesterday. Theosis, going on to the idea of the incarnation here, is a way the human beings can participate in this absolute unity. Upon completely detaching from all creatures and descending into nothingness, one is reborn as the Son of God. This rebirth is nothing other than the incarnation of God in human form. Therefore, the Heavenly Father is truly my Father, Quote, and I am the same Son and not a different one. His work is me, his only begotten Son, without any difference, close quote. God appears here in the human form when he multiplies himself in my form. Through detachment, one participates in the eternal birth of the Son and the Father. Through this participation, the human being achieves eternal life by participating in the eternal life constitutive of God's eternal self-creation. Because the human soul becomes indistinct from God the Father, God gives birth to his Son as human being. Again, here, Eckhart seems to follow Pseudo-Dionysius, for whom theosis is the actual replication of a one God. Finally, the birth of Christ in the soul releases the Holy Spirit. For every human being who undergoes perfect detachment, according to Eckhart, the very same process is reduplicated, and so God is reduplicated in every detached soul. Interesting idea here is that the incarnation is something that isn't just a historical event, but it's something that happens whenever we have this experience of the human being in their unity with God, and they give birth to Christ in the soul. We have the kind of living proof of incarnation that isn't limited to any particular spatial temporal moment. Okay, so I'm going to go on to discuss a few other concepts here, concepts such as freedom, ecstasy, and love. And also I want to thematize and ask about the status of these contradictions, of these apparent ones, and what to do with them. Okay. These reflections bring to bear one of Ueda Shitsutero, who wrote this commentary on Eckhart, more profound insights regarding Meister Eckhart's mysticism. Things and persons do not seem to be divine by themselves. Rather, the human being is divine only in virtue of his participation in God. Or to put it the other way, the human being is divine through God's mediation. Eckhart writes that the stick is holy when it is seen in the divine light. The stick is holy not merely qua stick, but in and through the divine light. Eckhart's affirmation then becomes mediated. Thus, the being of the distinct thing is not immediately or directly affirmed. It is not wholly in virtue of itself, but in virtue of something else. Thus, the being, which is indistinguishable from its divine being, is affirmed in a mediated way. The world of distinction, originally negated in detachment, is in fact affirmed, but it is not immediately affirmed. Rather, it seems affirmed indirectly, namely in virtue of the mediation of God's indistinct being. Affirmation of the world is achieved through mediation, through the Godhead. The essence of God as the one is a mediating power by means of which the differentiated world, as well as the expression of that differentiation in speech, is affirmed. So now I want to reflect a bit on the concepts of freedom that we could read out of some of these ideas. Because nothing lies outside of God, all things only exist insofar as they exist in God. And this does not mean that God is simply the aggregate of all things. Rather, we could think of God as a whole process that differentiates itself and maintains itself, or never goes outside itself in that differentiating process. Nothing is beyond God to determine God. And so because God transcends his indistinct being and gives himself determinate being, God is responsible for his own determinate existence. And that is to say that God is self-determining. God stands alone and is uncaused. God is the cause of himself, or God is without cause, right? Or what is the same? God is his own why, his own reason for being. Although God transcends this indeterminate being and determining himself, he nonetheless would maintain his indistinct being and the fact that determinate being itself is indistinct. For determinate being as such stands in contrast to nothing and is therefore distinct from nothing. It itself as a whole is indistinct. Thus, God's self-determination would appear contradictory. By an act of self-negation, God affirms himself. And this self-negation of freedom is simultaneously self-affirmation. The self-negation of freedom is self-affirmation, and because God's self-determination would consist in the self-transcendence of his very divine being, it seems that divine freedom demands that God go beyond himself in this act of self-determination. And in other words, freedom would require a kind of ecstasy, going beyond oneself. Via theosis, the human being can participate in the divine essence. And since the divine essence is free, the human being too can participate in the divine freedom of God. Eckhart proclaims, following Radler, I think another colleague of some of our participants here, that human freedom is nothing more than the participation in God's freedom. Through participating in the contradictory being of God, the human being becomes free. A little bit on ecstasy. As Nishitani, who also had a strong interest in Eckhart, astutely points out in his discussion of Eckhart, both the human being and God undergo ecstasy. Ecstasy is an act of going beyond oneself. In detachment, the human being negates his own distinct being and goes beyond his separate self into God. Likewise, God goes beyond his indistinct being in the emanation of the world and the birth of the sun. Nonetheless, ecstasy not only leads the self beyond itself, but also gives birth to the true self. The human being discovers his true self as a son of God, and God is eternally becoming his true self by overstepping his limits and returning to the Father by means of his self-loss. Ecstasy is twofold in two senses. Both God and the human being are constituted by ecstasy, and within that whole ecstatic process, each steps beyond itself twice, beyond both their indistinction as well as their distinction. Ueda Shitsutero, in his commentary, points out that the union of affirmation and negation is evident from the ecstatic quality of God. Being is nothing, the one is multiple. As Ueda points out, the relationship of the divine and human ecstasy is further clarified in Eckhart's answer to the question, why did God become a human being? Eckhart replies that he became man so that he could give birth to you as his one and only son. Ecstasy is a radicalization, it seems, of Christ's teaching in Matthew that, quote, whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. A reflection on love. As 1 John teaches, God is love. For Eckhart, this means that the agape of God is undifferentiated. God is being, and being is indistinct. Thus, God's love, too, should be indistinct, without any difference, plurality, or anything whatsoever. God's being is indistinct from God's very love. Being and love would be equally without difference in God. And yet, all love is a relationship and must differentiate amongst the beings in that relation. You have to have relata to have love. Because agape is without difference and is non-relational, just as God is non-relational insofar as God is absolute. Thus, agape appears to be contradictory, a kind of non-relational relation. Love appears to be a paradox. Love is a relation, and love and relation requires plurality. But if God is indistinct, then there should not be plurality. If there is no plurality, there cannot be relation and no love. Love without difference is a love that is not in relation, for difference is required for plurality, without which there cannot be relations. Yet, of course, love is relation. So one might worry that this non-discriminatory love would be a contradiction, a relation that isn't one. But Eckhart does respond and say something about this, that all love is ultimately self-love, and that if you abandon this, you would abandon the whole world. God is the being that is, and although God is indistinct, as indistinct, God is nonetheless inseparable from differentiation, as we've just said. Thus, there is plurality in God as a holy trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And given that God is and is three in one, the one whom God loves would be himself. God's identity would be constituted by the love relation of, most minimally, of the Holy Trinity. To be loved, God must be relational in his very identity. God must be relational in his indistinctness or in his non-relationality as such. Indeed, one of the greatest stumbling blocks to accepting the possibility of the selfless self is the insistence that there cannot be true contradictions. However, it would appear that without the possibility of this true contradiction, one might worry that God could not be love. What is important for loving is not so much that we understand, but that we live into it. In Christian terms, this would mean nothing other than to be a fool for Christ. Okay, a defense of mysticism here at the end. A brief reflection on the contradictions. If there are no true contradictions, and Eckhart's speech about God is contradictory, Eckhart's speech about God cannot be true. Given the mystical view that no speech about the world really succeeds, the mystic's own speech about the world would not succeed either. If the mystic's speech were true, it would be false. And again, kind of the self-refuting performative contradiction kind of thing could also apply right back at these people quite easily. Well, so it appears. Indeed, if Eckhart could successfully correlate his concepts with the absolute, he would refute his own thesis. He would hold the absolute to be intelligible, conceptually intelligible. If we could hold and save Eckhart from the contradiction and show the consistency of the thought, we would no longer need to transcend concepts in order to know God. The silence would be unnecessary. The mystical theology of Eckhart, it seems, may disappear. Can one save Eckhart by showing that his ideas really are consistent? The worry is this would undermine the commitment to transcending the word towards the union with God. If the philosophical language we're employing fails to capture being, the mystic's own concepts in philosophical language would fail to speak the truth. Hence, if a mystic claims that the truth regarding what being is transcends speech, and yet she formulates this truth about being in such conceptual speech, then there's a self-contradiction, and one cannot help but offer a self-referentially inconsistent account. Of course, if all conceptually determined speech fails to say what being is, then the philosophical speech of the one who advocates that speech must fail as well and cannot be exempt from the argument. Ironically, however, the criticism leveled against mysticism can very easily be used in its defense, and I think should be. This isn't a good argument against the mystics. It's a very bad one, actually. In order for the mystic to succeed, the mystic shouldn't succeed. If the mystic's argumentative speech were to succeed in expressing what being is, then the mystic's account would fail. For the mystic contends that such speech cannot succeed in expressing what being is. It's beyond all words. For this reason, the mystic must welcome and invite the reductio against her own argument. By failing to say what being is in her own argument, the mystic exemplifies the failure of the argument and demonstrates the truth of mysticism in her own words. Indeed, by pointing out that even their own argument fails to say what being is, one has shown the rather ironic consistency of the mystic's account. We're just following Proclus here again, as Eric is reminding us. Indeed, by pointing out that the mystic's argument fails to say what being is, one has shown the ironic consistency of the mystic's account. No argumentative speech succeeds, not even her own. Once one recognizes that the reductio against the mystic works in their favor, the complaint that mysticism is self-refuting no longer works as a viable counter-argument. I feel like I have to do this kind of argument all the time. In the book, I have to do this all the time. In the book of Exodus, Moses asked God for his name. The response we gloss is, I am that I am. This name of God as being is a name which can point beyond all names, or the same a name that shows that God does not have one. In Genesis, we find Jacob wrestling with this divine being. Jacob asks for the name. In reply, we get, why do you ask my name? Again, a lesson may be similar. By wrestling with God through our discursive interrogation into the I am that I am, the namelessness of the divinity and the divine being reveals itself. So if being falls into contradiction, and we want to say the law of non-contradiction governs our judgments, our speech, and the like, it seems that being would eschew conceptual determination or would transcend it. As a result, the truth of being would only be problematically understood in terms of a correspondence of concept and object, or even as an originary unity of the two. To insist that concepts can successfully match up with the divine essence, it seems would require a complete rehaul of our logic, something that I don't necessarily find in Eckhart himself. If our thinking is inspired by Eckhart, and it need not be, it appears that every conceptual correspondence would fail, for being is somehow inherently transcending our speech, falling into contradiction, and thereby leaves us with a fundamental mystery. Given that being is nonetheless uncovered as a being in the clearing away of these distinctions, of these particular conceptual determinations, an Eckhartian inspired theory of truth may acquire a more fundamental significance as a non-conceptual disclosure or revelation of being. Again, this is an Eckhartian inspired way of thinking. So I'm thinking for myself here with Eckhart. If the absolute can only be articulated as a contradiction, must we reconceive of the fundamental sense of truth as a kind of trans-conceptual revelation of the absolute? Accordingly, I want to ask whether Eckhart's contradictory proclamations concerning God and the Godhead should not lead us to rethink truth such that being would be true or in its truth when it is no longer concealed in the form of a matrix of concepts. Indeed, it appears that Eckhart calls us to apprehend the truth by transcending a certain form, at least, of the tree of knowledge, entering into the darkness of the divine light. But what might this trans-conceptual disclosure consist in? In the failure to conceptualize being, the philosopher experiences opposing and mutually exclusive categories falling into a unity. This experience, it seems, would not be conceptual, for the concept excludes its negation or a kind of discriminatory reason where there's this versus that. Yet it's an experience that would be impossible without the categories, for it's the attempt to categorize being which then heralds the collapse of the category into its negation. Being appears as a unity of opposition and is experienced in virtue of the collapse of being into nothing, of undifferentiation into differentiation. And we seem to experience being as the transcending of these conceptual truths, the contradiction, directly and immediately in the vanishing of categories into their negations. Accordingly, just to the point where the danger appears greatest and being recedes from our conceptual grasp, perhaps the saving power arises, that being may appear in the very non-conceptual experience of the self-negation of the categorical hold on being. Here, I want to emphasize this term experience and to contrast it with the knowing of a subject in the form simply of a judgment or propositional knowledge. Insofar as we have trouble saying what it is that being is, since it eschews this categorical determination, we're nonetheless still left with a presence of being in experience, for we encounter being as that which exceeds our attempts to say what it is. And then being is expressed by the that in the phrase that being is. That being is there seems to also be what remains as the what recedes, or the that is present as the receding of the what. Through the failed attempt to think being, we do nonetheless encounter the presence of this being. The what or essence of being reveals itself at least as the existence or that it is of being, the being whose essence is somehow also in existence or is their existence. If we characterize the concept as a kind of mediated relation to an object, the overcoming of this conceptual relation of an object could place us in an immediate relation to it, what we might take liberties to call, following Kant, something like intuition. This intuition of existence would be given upon the negation of the concept, the intuition of existence, however, would not be discursive. But what would a non-discursive intuition or intuiting that is experienced in the philosophical contemplation of being be? Since it is in virtue of reason by which the revelation occurs, it's through thinking that we come to have this experience of the contradiction. We see this contradiction really in a way through. So the intuition cannot be sensuous, but intellectual. Indeed, it is through reason that one experiences the failure of conceptual determination in face of the absolute. Just as being is revealed as existence, discursive reason becomes, to use a term from the tradition I've spent too much time with, an intellectual intuiting, or what is the same, to use an older term, a kind of nous, an immediate comprehension or contemplation of existence itself. On the one hand, nous transcends concepts, and there cannot be a contradiction without concepts. In nous, the true absolute is grasped as transcending all contradiction. And so in a way, there's no problem. Here, there's no conceptual articulation that's advanced, and so there's no contradiction either. And so the problem is solved. There's no distinctions, and so there's also no contradictions either. Differentiated and undifferentiated have both disappeared. And though their identity, the identity of both, is also disappeared. And in this way, the truth of the absolute in nous transcends the very opposition of consistency and contradiction. However, the indistinct is also distinct. In our own thinking, we're encountering this collapse of the two. And the experience of the collapse of the two, the experience of the negation of discursive reason, is in a way, another way of constituting that immediate experience, that all things are one in the collapsing of oppositions, is a way of experiencing indistinct being, the collapsing of oppositions into the indistinct being itself. So the coincidence of opposition itself is a way of constituting the experience of indistinct being. So it is simultaneously, it seems, transcending every opposition and therefore beyond all contradiction, and constituted by an experience of contradiction. And so this is the difficulty. So just a final word. On the one hand, or on the other hand, insofar as the intellectual comprehension of the absolute is an experience of the negation of the form of a kind of discursive reason that makes distinctions, operates in language and all this, and this is contradiction, the thinking of the absolute in nous is nothing other than the experience of contradiction, the overcoming of this conceptual way of working. Here, the contradiction is not asserted to be true as a proposition or judgment, but in a way, the contradiction shows itself, or shows the truth, for it discloses the transconceptuality of being. In light of this nous, the discursive reason is brought to contradiction, through which it shows the absolute truth that transcends all concepts, even the concept of contradiction itself. So thank you for your attention and for struggling through this with me. I didn't see all the comments. Okay, yes, I saw most of Eric's comments. Thank you very much, Eric, for your comments throughout the whole here. Yeah, I think it's okay if I field my own questions. Frank, it's okay. Eric, please.
A couple of things. First of all, I mentioned in one of the comments, I'm kind of troubled by the language of concept, conceptualization, etc. Clearly, that's coming out of the German idealist tradition, that that's your domain, so to speak. But it really doesn't capture what's going on in, I don't know about Eckhart. If he uses the Middle High German equivalent of because, then okay, concept is, I suppose, the best translation we've got. But in Dionysius, at any rate, and in the whole tradition from which Dionysius is coming, the word that is being used where you're using concept is the nous family, nous, noesis, noiton, all of that. And that's not the same as concept, at least in the modern use of the term concept. And the point there is that the absolute, shouldn't say the absolute because I'm trying to get away from German idealist.
Yeah,
thought,
I know.
Right? The first transcends intellection.
Yes.
Right? Now, almost everything you said about concepts is true of intellection. So, this isn't a fundamental objection, but I am troubled by the terminology there. But more substantively, I don't hear contradictions here. Let me give a couple of examples. The being is nothing. Well, as you yourself explained in arriving at that, it makes perfect sense. The point is being is not anything. Yeah. That's what's meant by being is nothing, where a thing means a determinate, this something. Right? So there's no contradiction in saying being is nothing. It makes perfect sense. It does mean that being, and in the sense in which the term being is used here, cannot be intellectually grasped. Fine. So all the transcendence you're talking about follows, but I don't hear a contradiction. Likewise, the transcendence immanence thing. It's perfectly illogical. If we misinterpret transcendence as separation or distinction, then the supposedly transcendent is one being among others and a member of a larger totality, distinct from other beings, therefore not transcendent. If we take transcendence seriously, not any being, right, not anything, it logically follows, therefore, that what we're saying is transcendent is not separate, not distinguishable from anything, and so is all things. Right? So no thing and all things, there's no contradiction there. We just think it through, and it makes perfect sense. So I very, very largely agree with sort of where you're going with this, but I don't think we need to talk about contradictions in order to get there. If we just think with sheer, straight, clear, hard logic, we arrive where where you're going. And that's something I think is really important, because otherwise my fear is that you start talking about mysticism and so on, and people hear irrationality. Whereas my position would be that what you yourself are, and Eckhart and Dionysius and Plotinus are rightly describing, I'm on board with it, with all of it, but it's just clear logical thinking. It's perfect. It's not only rational, it's utterly the completion and perfection and fulfillment of rationality.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to use the expression dialectical mysticism to distinguish it from some kind of supposedly irrational or experiential in a subjectivist sort of sense or something like that. It's just clear philosophical thinking. So do we really need to talk about contradictions? And does Eckhart call them contradictions in order to get where you're going?
Yeah, thanks for your questions. And I'm glad that you're awake and you feel the spirit move through you. It's always better for your papers to be received with passion and even passionate disagreement than falling asleep. So let me first maybe just take each the terminological concern first, and then let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the contradiction question. And then also, sorry, my timer, the relationship with rationality. Okay, so yeah, on the first point, I agree with you completely. As I said, kind of at the beginning, I am kind of thinking through Meister Eckhart, both at times on his own terms, and then also I'm thinking about how I could use his thought in my own thinking. Okay, so this is, in this way, I am importing in my own description. I use words like concepts regularly, which are not there, as you say, and it's not how the text in principle should be translated. Okay, so that's just admitted, and I have no objections to that point. What is important, though, is a distinction between a kind of mediated, kind of a knowing that's something like a dianoia, and something like and a nous, and a kind of immediate. And so there are important distinctions that we need to track, such as a kind of dianoetic or a noetic, etc., ways of operating. And I think that we can do that even if the language that I'm using is not always what you see in the text themselves. So that's well and good, and I appreciate that. And it actually is important. As I finish this essay or try to publish it somewhere, or parts of it, I'll have to revise the language. Now, when it comes to the contradiction, I really disagree about this point. I really disagree with you about this. I think that the notion of indistinct being is fundamentally contradictory and cannot be articulated without a contradiction. So I just disagree with you about this. So for example, I think indistinct being as such cannot be distinct from distinct being. And if you think it through slowly and logically, the indistinct as such is not distinct from distinction, and therefore is, strictly speaking, a logical contradiction. That if you try to say what indistinct being is, you will fall into contradiction only through, I would say, subterfuge and through, look, I do think that there is a kind of Pross-Hen, story that's told in the tradition that tries to get around the problem in various ways. But I actually think that this is a logical contradiction. I also think that the very same source of contradiction that you see in the identity of indistinctness and distinctness when it comes to, say, Godhead and world, is a contradiction you see in being a nothing. That in fact, first, as you said, God is not a thing. So that's easy enough, and there's no apparent contradiction there. Okay, point taken. But then once you see that God is indistinct being, the indistinct being can't even be distinct from nothing per se, nothingness as such, right? So yeah, it's not a what, but if you in fact talk about it, right? If you in fact make the claim, then you have a contradiction. That's exactly my point. You make what is not a what into a what, and therefore you have a kind of contradiction. So I strongly disagree about this, and I actually think it's important for, one could say, thinking about what the experience of the Godhead would be. First, you can think of it as transcending all of this mediated knowing, and you don't have any contradictions there at all. So at one level, they're all overcome and they're all impossible. But there's another way of describing it where you're experiencing the collapsing of this form of mediated knowing. And this isn't necessarily an articulation or a claim that the truth is contradictory. It would be an experience of the coincidence of opposition. Here I am describing that because I'm talking about it from the side of the negation of a kind of mediated knowing that's collapsing on itself, rather than say from the side of a kind of immediacy that is transcended all possibility of contradiction. So I actually don't know exactly what I want to say here. I think perhaps the contradiction can, in a way, be eliminated at a certain level. And the problem is therefore an apparent one, right? But I just don't know if maybe my way of describing this, if we're going to be in agreement on this. Maybe, I don't know if you wanted to have a quick response before we go on, or.
I think that we don't really disagree.
I think we don't.
It's almost right coming back, right, to saying, no, this isn't a real contradiction.
So point taken.
I think we don't really disagree. I think the differences of how best to articulate both of us trying to say the same thing.
I think that's probably very close to being right. So thanks a lot for your questions. Very, very, very helpful. I think Ian, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Following up on this, maybe just sticking with being and nothing for a moment. It's contradictory, but I wonder whether it's literally contradictory if we take Aristotle's formulation of the principle of non-contradiction. And it seems to me we can distinguish the respects in which the terms apply, and therefore the kind of contradiction in the strongest sense of the term dissolves. So if I say that with Eckhart, a cause can't share anything with that of which it's a cause. And so he'll make this type of argument. So if I say God is being, then that which God creates isn't going to share anything with the creator. And so things have to be nothing in themselves. He'll flip the argument around and say, if I want to call creatures beings, well, then God is no thing, God is nothing, God shares nothing with those creatures. And so it seems what I've done there is, there was a contradiction, but the terms, they're not used in the same respects, right? And so I guess what I'm wondering is why call that like the same thing as A and not A, just like a flat out contradiction.
Right, so what are the two senses that you just used? Could you repeat?
What's that?
Can you repeat what the two senses are that you just distinguished of non-being?
So one would be the non-being of, let's say, created things. If I'm going to call God being, and then he'll say, if I call creatures being, then God is not creatures. God has to be other than that which he creates, and so God is nothing. He'll do the same thing with being and intellect in the Parisian question. I mean, this is like, it's a form of like the analogy of attribution. Like this is an understanding of analogy. And so I guess what I think I'm doing there is I think I'm saying that these terms are not used in the same respects. And so it's not a literal violation of the principle of non-contradiction.
Yeah. So, if you take being to be univocal, then you fall into the problems that I'm stating. But if you take being to be said in many ways, as Aristotle says, and they point to one meaning, and then you follow that line through, Aquinas and the like, then arguably you can get around it. I have arguments also against the pros hand and the analogy appeals in my book. I can't go through it now, but I don't think that works. I don't think that avoids the contradiction either. So I'm very difficult with this position. This traditional Catholic view is inspired also by Aristotle. think is deeply problematic, but let's just put that to the side for now. So yeah, I agree that maybe what you can say is that their being is said in many ways, and then you distinguish all of these different ways that they're said, and then you can get around the contradiction. I think you'd have to show how that works in every case where there seems to be a contradiction, such as where there seems to be ecstasy, or in the case of love, or in the case of incarnation, right? Or in the case of Trinity. And so I've gone through all these cases, and I think to make that case, you really have to show it in every one. I am, however, curious about the kind of ultimate sense of being. Whatever it's going to be traced back to this sense of this kind of indivisible indistinctness, right? That whatever there's going to be is going to point back to this. And if we think from that position, then in fact, the non-being of the creatures should in principle be the non-being of God himself. That is to say, there's no way that you're going to be able to actually hold the indistinctness of God in a certain way apart from not only the non-being of the creatures, but not even the being of the creatures. And actually, these different senses seem to collapse in the indistinctness. So this is part of the problem, is that the indistinctness doesn't allow for this nice parity, for this nice division, so that you have a nice, clean, intelligible whole that we can feel comfortable about. I think actually the indistinctness is a source of a lot of problems. Conceptually, it's a source of a lot of problems. Even if it is not the only sense, if it's the primary sense and the ultimate sense, if it's there anchoring the whole thing, then I think it's still a problem. Now, I would also be interested to see the kind of, think about the way that analogy and proshen, the extent to which Eckhart is using it and how he's using it, where he's using it. So I think that would also just be something for me to follow up on.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me he's using it everywhere, even if he runs into some of the problems that
he is using it. Yeah.
Talking about, but all over his Latin writings in particular. Yeah.
And this is also a confession as well, as I'm really a lot more interested in the German writings than the Latin ones, but I have been going back to them more recently. So yeah, I don't want to deny that the appeal to the analogy is there and that this is said in many ways. But if in the end we have to trace it back to this indistinctness, I would, put the question back and ask, tell me what indistinct being is, right? And right, see if you can hold it distinct from any of those distinctions that you've given me, right? So you've given me all these distinctions, right? Hold it back. Yes, again, not a what, but again, if the claim is made, it becomes a what, and that's the problem. That's the whole problem. You're not talking about anything if you're not allowed to make it into a what. So,
right.
I'm going to be, again, we
unknowing
disagreeing. Yes, we may not be disagreeing, but it's a very helpful comment and question. Thanks.
Thank you.
So what's the time here? 10:44. Any final comments or questions? The discussion's been quite helpful. So yeah. Oh, Elizabeth, yeah, please.
I don't actually have a question, but I wanted to I got very enthusiastic towards the end of your paper where you were trying to articulate the way in which the experience of the collapse is fundamental to whatever is going on here. I guess I just wanted to say I absolutely agree with that. And I try and talk about that in my paper, so maybe we can keep kind of continue the conversation. But I think it's really one of the things that I think for you might be interesting to think about has to do with the distinction between what's the experience of the birth of the word in the soul is and what this breakthrough into the ground is. And in terms of thinking about this, like what is the role of indistinction, and how is it different in those two? That it's not, that it's like there's something even more, right, than the coincidence of opposites that is, you know, characteristic of what happens when you have the birth of the word in the soul. So yeah, anyway, so that's just my, this is just a
yeah. Thanks. Should I say something, or?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Thanks. No, I'm glad that you that you were moved by the end of it. Something that I've been trying to articulate, but I have trouble articulating it, and I suppose that is not. Probably should be what's happening as I try to write about, you know, the indistinct, as Eric and I have been going back and forth about this. But yeah, what I'm trying to say at the end of the paper is that this kind of one way of understanding the mystical experience is as a fully intelligible, I mean, in a certain way, it's a realization of, I mean, it's something that is in a way intelligible. It's a kind of, it's something that one comes to, or that one engages in because of one's intellectual struggle. So I mean, it's this on the one hand, the collapsing of the opposition is only something one experiences because one's been struggling with, you know, categories and the like. Only because one's been thinking that the collapse is something one in a way can make sense of. So there's a way in which, though, that collapse, however, the experience of that of the indistinction, the experience of the collapse of categories, is in a way an intellectual experience. It's right, and so that's important to me. I'm not trying to advance some kind of effective mysticism where, like, I know pseudo-Dionysus was received in many different ways over the course, and there was like an effective reception and more of an intellectual one and stuff. So there's those confusion, but I definitely want to hold the line that here we are dealing with an intellectual, what I've called experience, you know, of the indistinct. And I think one way to really, and even to draw on the Aristotle, you know, it goes back, you know, that when we deny the law of non-contradiction, what happens? We lose all the distinctions. And this is a big problem. We need to maintain the distinctions. However, when you're experiencing the indistinct itself, you don't want to hold on to those. The whole point is to not hold on to those. And that's why when you dogmatically cling to the principle, like it's a divine, you're going to miss the Godhead. And this is, in a way, the point I'm trying to make, is a kind of dogmatic clinging to the principle. You're going to miss everything in the most fundamental way. So let me say it with passion here, because it's something that I also feel, even though I want to say this is supposed to be intellectual, at least drawing on Meister Eckhart. And regarding your last point about the birth of Christ in the soul and the way in which the indistinct functions differently, it's something that I have to think more clearly about, because I've been more hyper-focused on, in a way, the logic of the sentences and what's happening, and less on maybe the varieties of ways in which these are operating differently. So it's something that I need to pay more attention to. So thanks all. Yeah, I look forward to your talk on Eckhart. And I don't know how many other Eckhart talks we have left. There might be, I think Ian will also talk a little bit about Eckhart as well, I think. Ian, did you have your hand up? I saw that you were.
Well, I have lots of questions, but I know we're past time. So yeah, we could talk for a while. So
yeah.
But I mean, you're the organizer, so you get to decide.
I don't want to abuse my power, so we went a little over with Eric's. I'll allow myself a couple more minutes. So if you have one question that you want to ask, maybe we can just do one quick question or not quick.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, so several things have come up, but I wonder about, I agree with the speculative mystical approach that Eckhart's a paradigmatic example of that, or what Eric called dialectical mysticism. But I wonder about this last claim that it's only in going through this contradiction at an intellectual level that we can make the breakthrough and experience the birth of the word in the soul. I mean, Eckhart's a preacher. I think even his talk of releasement, I don't think is indexed solely to the intellectual tradition. So I guess I worry about the exclusivity of that. And that's related to an earlier question I had, which concerned the union with God. And so this is actually you going from a different direction. You talk about the union of God with the human being. And I'm wondering whether that should be nuanced a little bit. So what in the human being becomes one with, let's say, God first, or let's say more deeply, recognizes or appropriates the always operative single oneness between the spark of the soul and the Godhead. And so there are different answers in Eckhart, and there's a lot of debate about this. Is it the active intellect? Is it the passive intellect? Is the spark beyond the intellect, a spark that's clearly beyond the will? So those would be two initial questions to ask: the status of the need for the intellectual in Eckhart, and then secondly, where does this union occur?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and I've marked them down here because I need to be really careful about both of those. So thanks a lot. Yeah, the first point about this as a preacher and in this discussion of Gelassenheit and releasement and the like. Yeah, perhaps it's too narrow just to limit it to this contemplative thing. That's something that I have to consider when I think about my own. Trying to find God in, or the Godhead in, my own philosophical experience. This is what has led me through these reflections. So here it's also, I'm speaking autobiographically, and I should be careful not to speak exclusively. But I can see in a way what an intellectual form of mysticism would look like, because it's at least one path, and perhaps also thinking about Eckhart and his role as preacher, that maybe there are other ways to this union. And you're exactly right that I should be more careful about what exactly is what exactly in the human being is made one. Because in one way there's a lot that's let go, and then the question is, what's let go, what's unified? Is it this spark, this eternal ground in the soul? Because there is this kind of eternal dimension of the soul that's there, right? And so I think, more specificity is needed as I rework the draft here. So that's really helpful, and something that it's good to not lose sight of. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, it's 10:53. Maybe we stop here. Unless anyone has any really urgent questions or critiques they really want to before we go. Okay, I really appreciate the spirited discussion, and I hope, I know that for a lot of you this will be very late, and we'll be having our speakers from across the pond. Well, not everybody, sorry. I think Paula, you'll giving your talk this afternoon, and also Ryan Hacker will be here in the afternoon. So if I don't see you then, I'll see you tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow morning. Okay, all right, thanks a lot, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.